Welcome to this very special edition of the Perfectors Podcast. I'm Leslie, and my co-host is my sister-in-law, Tessie. We started this podcast many years ago after many years of fundraising for clean water around the world. It didn't take us long to figure out everything's political, from the water we drink to the clothes we wear, and we wanted to start a podcast where we, a couple of women from the Midwest, learn, along with our friends, about how our actions affect the world around us. We call ourselves, and the people we interview, the Perfectors. Not because we believe in perfection, but we do believe in creating a community of people who are diving into issues, who are wrestling with the inaccuracies we've been taught, and learning to do better, not do perfectly, but do better by everyone around us. And I think we will always believe that. So thanks for joining us.
Sister, you gave a little foreshadowing there in the I think we'll always believe that. But today, I'm going to try to get through this one without crying. But for those who've been with us for a long time, you know that that is not a promise I'm ever able to fully keep, typically. But today, we've actually got some big news to share. After 5+ years in the podcast world, we're saying goodbye for now.
We are. That feels really big to say that here on the microphone. We've been talking about it, of course, for a couple of months now, but we're recording our last episode today. So yes, sister, this is a positive thing. It's also a little bittersweet, so I would understand if there are tears for sure. I was telling you before we we hit record that it's a lot to process, and I haven't processed it yet. So I haven't been getting those wet, stinging eyes. I don't cry because I'm on Zoloft, and for some reason that makes me not
Your
cry.
Zoloft tears, though, as we talked to me.
There's Zoloft tears. Longtime listeners will recognize that. Because I feel like there's just been so much going on, and it kind of feels very surreal to be in this moment right now, saying goodbye to our beautiful little Yeti mics and our amazing podcast listeners and community. But that really is what we're going to do today. We're going to do a little reflection. We're going to talk about steps forward. We're going to talk about just, of course, the world and the podcast community and media in the United States in this moment of time. It's not going to be a simple goodbye, but we did want to spend some time wrapping this whole beautiful thing up.
And of course, telling y'all why we're doing it is important to us because we do feel like this is a family, right? We've heard from so many of you over the last 5 years about how much you've learned and grown with us and with each other. And we do not take that lightly. We genuinely feel like this community y'all have cultivated is like a powerful space in the universe. And so we want to make sure we try to give that honor that as much as humanly possible. In our limited time, we're going to try not to go on and on because how long can you really say this? But I would love to start at the start, right? Because it feels surreal to talk about the fact that we started podcasting in 2016, early 2016. So, sister, break down what was going on in 2016, because if our listeners are anything like me, I think it's some kind of self-preservation that I've somehow forgotten a lot of what's happened over the last 4 years.
Oh, wow. Well, we were so young in 2016. We all were, right? If you look back, it's hard to recognize yourself. I think what's really funny about this podcast and the fact that we have been doing this for so long is I remember the origin. I remember the start of it in February of 2016. We were hanging out at your house. You had just moved to Michigan, and we were visiting for the weekend. And we were just oh, this is so great. This is what we do. We drink coffee and we talk. And then we transition to lemonade after lunch and we talk. And then actually, I don't know that we've ever had lemonade together after lunch.
We've never had lemonade. That's why I really enjoyed this ride.
It seemed like a good transition to get to the wine where we would drink our wine and talk. And podcasting was really new. You were listening to podcasts. I don't think I'd ever listened to a podcast, but I knew that I loved talking to you about like really getting into it with you of the nitty gritty of what was happening in the world around us. And I think basically I'd follow you anywhere, Tessie. So I don't know which one of us, I'm sure it must have been you, of just like, oh, we should do this on a podcast. Like, we should hit record and talk to our friends and do this. And I was just like, sure, let's do it. And like within 2 weeks, we full-fledged had a podcast.
That's right. I remember a few things too. One, I remember that our husbands are also our biggest cheerleaders. So the second we said it, they were like, you need to do it. Of course you need to do it. And the other thing I remember is that you were also writing a book, like it was in the editing phase. And so we were talking about marketing because both of us are marketing in our day hours. And so we were talking about marketing, and I remember saying like, oh, you should have a podcast. Like, I think this is going to be a new way of marketing things, which feels surreal now because everybody has a podcast, which we'll get into. And everyone that is like, even massive corporations have a podcast to talk about what they're doing. And podcasting companies have like a whole marketing bit that like they do little series sponsored by MasterCard or whatever. I mean, it's just a totally different world. But at that time, I just thought I could see this happening. Like, more people are on the road, more people are whatever. And so part of it was the reason that we named it Mama Bear Dares Podcast was we just thought, like, why not kill two birds with one stone? You have a book coming out called The Mama Bears Manifesto, and we believe in that mama bear. And so it really took off from there. I feel like when we decided like, oh, we could talk about your book. We could talk about what our friends do. And then it was just like everything else. Like, once we start talking really fast and really high pitched, I know listeners can't imagine my voice going high pitched, but every once in a while it climbs like a quarter of an octave. And then we were off. It was just like, forget about it. 2 weeks later, we had 3 podcasts recorded.
Right. And we love like, do we love telling people what to do? Maybe a little bit, because I remember on the way home from your house, we're like, okay, let's think of a name of this podcast. And we were like, oh, Mama Bear Dares. Like, we can have a dare at the end of the podcast to like record, to send people out into the week. And I think that was, for me, one thing when I think about not doing this anymore, I worry about my engagement in the world a little bit, because this podcast has been so influential in my life, in that when we research something and when we talk about something, I am inspired to make a change in my life for the better. And that was kind of where that dare came from. We were challenging each other, and we were, dissecting issues that we're like, wait a second, no, we have a say in this. We can do something about this. So let's do it, and let's encourage other people to do it. Of course, learning from our guests along the way. And I think that's one of the things I'll miss most, is having the lens of the podcast as I move through the world. It has trained my eyes and my brain to kind of think like, okay, well, here's something I'm hearing a lot about. What's really going on, and how can I play a part of this? So I'm sure we'll figure it out, right? Like, we'll continue to talk to each other and to the friends that we've made in this community. But that's something that has been really just one of my favorite parts, is just training myself, like, to think like a podcaster, really, to think like a writer or someone who is observing the world. And then we had this little nugget of a dare to focus all of that learning. Yeah.
I mean, I've obviously been on the record that I love research, but I'm exactly where you are, in that my research was always targeted towards what's real, but then also, how do we engage with this revelation? How do we change things? And I was thinking, as you said that I don't know that we like telling people what to do, because the truth of the matter is we're always like, I don't know what we're doing. We are just doing the best we can. What I think it is that you and I are constantly trying to make ourselves better. Like, it's one of the things that I immediately hooked into with you. It was always just like, how do we continue to evolve? And when we evolve, how do we bring more people into that evolution too? Because we know the more you evolve, the more you walk through the world with open hearts and open minds, the more inclusive you make the world, the kinder you make the world, the more compassionate. And you and I, above everything else, want to live in a world that's kinder and more compassionate and more open. And so I think it was less, yours is funnier to say that we like telling people what to do. But I really think it's more about like, we want to bring more people into this world where once you're there, once you're always striving to learn more, once you're always trying to empathetically listen to other people's stories and acknowledge the truth there, it is freaking amazing. There is no limit to how cool of people you meet. It gives me goosebumps thinking about all the blessings I've gotten because I train myself every day to walk in the world, even when I know it might hurt a little bit, might hurt me, might hurt my family. Because that to us is the right way, is the only way we get through this with our compassion intact.
You are so right. Yes. And yeah, I was trying to be cute, I think, when I said we like telling people what to do. But I also think like this whole journey has been, like you're saying, one of openness a little bit. Like we genuinely loved getting messages from listeners that were like, hey, what about this? What do you think about this topic? And just people putting these like gifts of questions at our feet so we could be like, oh, I've been thinking about that too. What do I think about that? Like, how will this impact my life if I know more, right? Because sometimes when you learn more, it's not always pleasant. We say that a lot too. Like learning can really be painful and uncomfortable, and just having a community of people here on the podcast that we can dive into those things like bravely, I guess, like, okay, we know this could really like mess with my whole life. This could mess with a lot of my priorities and a lot of my actions, but like spurring each other on to that research anyway has been a joy. I also think we'll get into some of our favorite topics and our favorite interviews here, but I think we've always like a guiding principle of this podcast has been just a sense of wonder, and I think that I mean, almost every time we would get off of an interview, we would immediately like hop back on Skype or hop back on Zoom and be like, can you believe they just spent an hour with us? Like, we are the luckiest people in the world. Like, this is incredible. Like, I know so much more now having spent an hour with this guest. And I just feel like we have been so incredibly lucky with the people that we've gotten to talk to as well.
Totally agree. And to take it back to like when we first started in 2016, there was something like 3 to 5% women podcasts only, women-led podcasts. I mean, we were pioneers in that regard, right? And it showed. We immediately got really great guests. We immediately shot to new and noteworthy. We immediately got sponsors to come on. I mean, way quicker than most will find it. Most people never have sponsors. Most people never get the guests that we do. And though I want to take credit because my ego is really flattered by that, the reality is it was kind of perfect timing too. And obviously you listeners who were with us at that time or soon thereafter had played a major role in that. But I think that we have to think about, like, we really shot to the moon there, and we weren't necessarily expecting it. So when I think about how the podcast started and some of my favorite bits were right in the beginning, when every time someone would write and be like, hey, can I send you a shirt? Or, hey, can I do that? We'd be like, oh my God, what? And the first time we got a book from an author, we're like, we get to have books sent to us just for hitting record on a podcast and talking to our best friend. This is ridiculous. What took us so long, right? So,
oh my gosh.
When I think, and I also still laugh, like 2 months after we started, we did a Things We've Learned podcast as an April Fool's, and my husband still hasn't let me down. Like, you guys did a Things We've Learned after 2 months of being in a podcast. But that's us, right? It's just like, that's our mentality. Always learning, always trying to do right by, because we're, and obviously we've talked many times about busyness, but we're busy women. And we know what it means for you all to hit play seeing that this thing's going to be an hour plus or even a half hour. Like, we know how valuable time is.
Yes.
And you have no idea how often we talked for a week about, is this worth their time? Is this person, after a recording or an interview, we'd always be like, is there value in this? Because we have not released probably 10, maybe more podcast interviews because we thought that was fun. They're a great person, but our listeners will not get anything out of it. So what I've loved about this whole process with you is like, yeah, in some regards, we just thought, let's hit record and talk to our best friend. But because we're us, we also were like, we want to value our listener and make sure they understand and can at least feel that we value them enough to give them our very best, what we're capable of that day. We might have sucked sometimes, but that's all we had that day.
It's true. And yeah, it's been a ride. So we started in 2016. Obama was president. One of those episodes that we did not release was when we celebrated Hillary's victory. And we had recorded it before we heard the results of the election. So, the topics that we were able to talk about, I think earlier on, were a bit less, everything is political, but they were a bit less focused on the systemic makeup of our country.
Yeah.
But, I remember one episode we did was Hamilton and moms. Like, Hamilton was really hot back in, it still is, but like back in 2016, sometimes.
It always will be in our hearts.
Yes. Like, sometimes we were able to devote more time to just more fun topics, I guess.
Fun and flouncy, as Cody Rigsby would say.
Yes. But also, like, around that time is when the documentary 13th came out. And I think as these moments in pop culture or just like the general culture, as they happened, it helped us to evolve and it helped the podcast to kind of find its voice. Because those were the things, like I said before, that we were sitting around and talking about, drinking lemonade, just kidding, drinking coffee or wine. And that really shaped like the progression of the podcast as we were following our interests, we were following the headlines, trying to make sense of the headlines, and our own, personal curiosities as well.
100%. And we also are dedicated to being good stewards of our power. And we started to recognize more and more, even though we had known it before, we recognized more and more that as white women with a platform, we had to utilize our power in a good way. So fun and flouncy started to feel really more like immaturity when George Floyd and Ahmed and all of these people, right, Eric Garner, once all these things were happening, we believe in time for fun, obviously, if you are paying attention on our social media. And we believe even in times that are very intense, or maybe especially in times that are more intense, joy is an act of resistance. Yes. We believe that to our core. Yes. We also believe that as white women with power, we can't just be flippant about what that means in the world. And so if you have been with us for a while, you watched us kind of come to that realization that, you know what, we have this space and this voice and this microphone, and maybe we could use it to bring other white women, especially, on this journey of learning how to step into our power and embolden ourselves to open up more spaces for other people of color, women of color, that kind of thing. And what a privilege to be able to do that.
Yes, it was a huge privilege to be able to grab the mic and, just personally to be able to understand these issues and understand our own power in responding to these issues. I feel like, again, like we joked about it a lot, but every week was free therapy in some ways for the two of us, I think. And then obviously when we invited guests in, we were getting real expert knowledge about how to respond to the world. And I think as it evolved, we also were digging into things. We're both moms of girls and boys, and we were talking a lot about just using that power that we had as moms or as influencers in the lives of young people. So we didn't shy away from things like Brock Turner. I remember that being a huge moment for us in terms of like, hold on a second, this opens a huge portal into this whole culture that we have here. That was right around the time of the Me Too movement, the beginning of that. We talked a lot about, one of the probably the most influential and most listened to episodes was the Mama Bear Mini, like we called them, that was titled "Boys Will Not Be Boys," those were all very, very clarifying in my own life of just like, what do I think of these things and how will I respond in that power? And it is all so it's all tied up together. Like, I remember thinking, and we talked about Brock Turner's swim, like suit and tie. He's a swimmer, and that's what gets blasted into the media. Whereas obviously we see black men in jumpsuits as a direct juxtaposition there of the way that our culture and our country and the media respond to things like this. So around that time, I think, is when we got pretty serious. And it was such a joy to see our listeners getting serious as well. Like, we definitely found this community of people who, you got to be careful who you sit next to at Thanksgiving, because if you want to talk about fun and flouncy, we may start a conversation about how delicious the turkey is, but then we remember our episode where we talked about like food apartheid, like food deserts in Lauren Ornelas, I think, was a guest that we had that was doing a lot of really great work with just food equity. And so I loved kind of the turn in that in the podcast and the topics, and that recognition of power and influence and how we can use that for good.
And to me, at least, and I hope, listener, you felt this too, because I saw so many listeners get braver on their own social media platforms and things like that. But I know for me, doing those episodes like the Boys Will Not Be Boys and the #MeToo and all of those, I also really ignited this personal journey in me, to where you and I, of course, talked about our own experiences with, as Amy Schumer calls it, grape, that gray area between heavy petting, which is sexual assault, and rape, unconsented heavy petting, I should say. And it started this personal journey in me where I'm sure you, listener, like us, like Leslie and I talk about, sometimes when we have conversations with older members of our family, or we're following older people on social media or things like that, some of the pushback from older women, especially of the Me Too movement, was like, it's always been like that. And my personal journey has really been forged through this podcast, I think, to evaluate, well, is that okay? It's actually not okay that you were sexually harassed your entire working life, and it's actually not okay that your boss used to put his hand on the small of your back. These things aren't okay. And just because they happened to us, because of course, certainly even things that happened to me that I was just like, ugh, that's just part of college life or what have you. Now I can see that was never okay. And I'm so freaking glad that people are saying, wait a second, that was never okay. And it certainly is not okay now either. And that was like something that was forged through the podcast, was like really talking through things. And that quote, like, I don't even know how I feel about a thing until I write about it. I've always believed that. And then it really manifested in podcasting too. Oftentimes I didn't really know about how I felt about a thing until we started talking about it, until we turned record on and heard from our listeners too, what they were thinking. And it really helped me make gray areas, even things that were like on the world stage, more black and white for me when they should have been black and white all along. And I just didn't understand the context fully until you and I talked about it. And I'll forever be grateful for that too, because it's changed the way I consume information, period. Like, just because that's always been the way it is, just because Black and brown people have always been going to prison at higher rates for the same stuff white people do at a higher rate. And I never thought about it before. Maybe I should think about that now, right? Like, it's changed the way I consume information, even when it's told in a way that's like, yeah, obviously this is true. And you're like, wait, why is that obvious?
Yeah.
Right? Do you find yourself doing that too?
Definitely. And that is one of my fears of not podcasting anymore, is like, I really need to continue to think this critically about things and to write about these things so that I can understand these things. And I mean, one thing I don't regret, I guess, but a little bit, like we used to always say in our beginning, when you know better, you do better, some iteration of this Dr. Maya Angelou quote. And I think we realized at some point, like, we need to be like attributing that quote to her every time we say it. And so that's something too that I just realized, like, so much of our language and our language is very, very, very important. And that's another thing that I've learned along the way here, is that language has such power, and that we should be constantly examining not just what the world tells us, but like these long held beliefs, or even just the idea of, our intentions were good, saying no, when you know better, you do better. But we can't just rely on good intentions. We need to examine those intentions and make sure that we're doing right by others in all. And that's just a really small example of an evolution, I think, of, thank goodness, over 5 years. If we were still stagnant and saying the same thing, I'd be disappointed. I don't think we would have lasted this long either. We would have gotten bored, I think.
Yes.
But yeah, that's something that I think about and have learned along the way. Who are some of your favorite guests, would you say?
I mean, so many. One that I keep telling people was a highlight was Shannon Watts. And I think it was a highlight for a couple reasons. One, of course, she is like famous in our space, right? In terms of mama bears who saw an issue and were like, F this isn't okay. I'm going to do everything I can to make it a little bit less intense and wrong. So, like, one, she just was like the epitome of what we'd been wanting to interview, right? And then two, just she in general was a fun person to talk to. I mean, we opened the podcast and she said, I had a migraine, so I'm literally laying down on my yoga mat. I hope the sound is okay. And I had so much respect for that. Yeah. Like, yes, I want to show up and I want to be here, but I'm going to take care of myself in the process, even if it messes with your sound just a little bit. To me, I'm like, she's got that part figured out. That is super smart. But that's why we re-released it when we changed up our name, right? Because to me, she really did epitomize the perfectors, the mama bear. Like, she was that and continues to be, obviously.
Yeah, there's so many of these interviews where I can remember exactly where I was when I recorded it, and she in like the moment in time, and she was one of those. It was right after the murder of George Floyd. It was a hot day. We just were so nervous and so thrilled to get to talk to her. Another guest that reminds me a little bit of Shannon is April Rain, and she was the one that kind of started that hashtag Oscars So White. And the reason I think I put those two together a little bit is because neither of them were setting out to start a revolution, and yet that's what happened. And I think that epitomizes that whole idea of the influence that all of us have inside of us. Like, you never know how your actions are going to ripple out into this world. Your actions will always ripple out into this world. And so make them good. Like, make your actions matter. And I think I learned that from both Shannon and April, like, seeing something that disturbed them and doing something. Again, neither of them thought they were going to spark a revolution or a place for others who were like, oh yeah, I kind of think that too, to like really organize and make change. But that's what's happened, because they jumped into something that they jumped into an injustice that was keeping them up at night, and the ripple effects have challenged and changed all of us. And I just think of
entire systems.
So many of our guests have done that, have started from these places of just like, no, this isn't okay, and I'm going to do something. I don't know what that is going to end up looking like, but I'm jumping into this because it matters, and I do have a say.
Yeah. Speaking of Oscars, Judy Heumann was another top highlight for me. And the movie Crip Camp on Netflix was actually nominated for an Oscar this year. They didn't win, but I mean, it was powerful to see the line of wheelchairs and things at the Oscars, including Judy Heumann, who we interviewed. And this is how surreal it is to be on a host of this podcast. Zach and I, my husband, watched Crip Camp. 2 minutes later, I wrote you and our producer, Kathy, and I said, I really, really want this woman, Judy Heumann, on the podcast because she's a staple in the film. And then she was on the podcast. I mean, it was so surreal. But the reason I loved her interview was, here's this woman who contracted polio at like 1.5, has been wheelchair bound since. And she goes to this camp for people with disabilities and realizes, like, we've got no independence. Nobody cares about us except for maybe a parent or two. We have the same desires. We have sexual desires. We have hunger. We have thirst. We have the desires to move about the world independently and have a job, right? And we're talking about the 60s when literally they would just put people who were disabled into homes that were a mess. And the film showed how messy and uncompassionate and terrible these places were. And she thought, we're fully human. And she fought every system that there was to fight. Teachers' unions, politics, obviously. She partnered with the frickin' Black Panthers to hold a sit-in to make the Disability Rights Act go through. I mean, she is like this freaking powerhouse who's in her 70s now and continues to fight for disability rights. And to me, she just really, her book is so good too, Being Human. And again, she epitomized that whole thing where she also didn't set out to become a trailblazer and one of the most inspiring activists we've seen in this country, but here she is because she realized, like, if not me, then who's going to do this? And that was like always what we wanted our listeners to understand and to embody ourselves too, that it doesn't matter if you never become famous like Judy Heumann. Like, that's not the point. The point is to show up and to do what needs the right thing, and then others will follow you. Maybe that means only 2 people will follow you. Maybe it means millions and you actually get new legislation passed. But that is a life worth living.
Yeah, I think about Judy Heumann all the time, really, because I learned so much. That was not a space that I understood at all. And so you're saying, like, you might just influence 2 people, but you might influence someone, and then a generation from now, that influence will be manifested in the world. And I think that realized. Judy Heumann, like, she is a generation older than us. And yet, like, her work now, like, with this, I mean, obviously her work has always been critically important. But just with this Crip Camp and, you know, an Oscar-nominated documentary, like, her work is outlasting people of her own generation. I mean, it is changing the way that this generation coming up is looking at disability rights, and incredible.
I mean, no one knew about the fact that I shouldn't say no one, but a lot of people didn't know about the work those disability rights activists had done in the 60s and 70s until now, 50 years later. And they were keeping up the work for the full 50 years, not having any wide acclaim or knowledge of their work. Right. And so that's exactly what you're saying. Like, you do it anyway because it's the right thing to do.
One other guest I want to talk about, because I think in the larger, like the landscape of this podcast, we started out, and my book probably influenced this, as like a pretty Christian podcast, in that our worldview was very, I don't know, I was going to a Lutheran church at the time. I think you were taking walks on Sunday at that time. I'm not sure if you were going to church or not, but my book is for Christian moms, is the audience, like Christian moms who want to be active in social justice issues, and that is kind of where we started this podcast. Part of that was influenced by a publisher who we were working fairly closely with in terms of guests, things like that. We've had Jen Hatmaker on the podcast, you know. But you can see, I think, if we were to look back at old episodes, you can see a kind of a faith evolution a little bit as well. And one person who I still just get goosebumps when I think about that we were able to interview was Rachel Held Evans. And I remember the moment that it came through from her publicist, like, hey, we know about your podcast. Would you want to interview Rachel? You and I were in Tanzania at a safari lodge, like living the craziest life, celebrating some of the water projects that we had helped fundraise for. And we were just like, Rachel Held Evans wants to be on our podcast. And this is a podcast that I still send to people to say, hey, listen to this. I'd love to know what you think. I just recently did that because unfortunately there was a kind of an influential church in my community who I got wind of a sermon that was very damaging and just very infuriating about LGBTQ, the rights of people, but also like the lives of students I felt were really being harassed in this sermon. And Rachel Held Evans is someone that we can go back to and say there's so much common ground and there's so much we can build from, but so much of her work was helping other Christians really understand the humanity and the godliness of all of us. And I didn't actually get to be on that interview, which was one of the great sorrows of my life.
I know.
But
seriously,
you had the most amazing conversation with her. And that is another person that has, influenced my life as a Christian, as a follower of Jesus and love with a capital L. And that episode continues to be one that I go back to. Her book is one that I go back to in moments of like, how can we be why can't all of us be all of these things with the foundation of love and Jesus's teachings?
And for me, we had Jen on, and we're even seeing, for those who are like kind of in the Christian space, we're seeing like Beth Moore now to kind of go through this personal revolution, and now it's a public revolution. But Rachel, for me, was the first one to do it. She was the first one to put it all on the line. She had a lot of influence. She had a lot of book deals. She had a lot of speaking engagements. And we got to see her come to that capital L love in real time, piss a lot of people off while she did it. And she just kept freaking showing up. I really can't think of a single other person that has like shaped my faith and my spirituality more than her because of that, because she constantly talked about, even in our podcast, like, if it ain't love, it's trash. And Jesus would think the same thing. And so, we're seeing today in Canada a Muslim family being literally run over on purpose. And we're seeing all these attacks on Muslims, especially around the world, and so often carried out by Christians. And unfortunately, Rachel passed away a few years ago, but I just can't help but think like, God, I'm craving her voice. I want her voice to tell Christians to stop it, that undoubtedly this is not who we were created to be. This is not at all a life that Jesus would live. And so it just is like, sometimes it feels more confusing without her voice for me. But one of the things that's remained true is that you and I, for the most part, depending on the day, still identify as Christians. But the podcast, one of my intentions was to show a different way of living our faith, and a different way of talking about it, and a different way of being in the world as a Christian. Like, even on my personal Instagram page, so many people say, like, you're just unlike any other Christian I've known. And the reality is, like, I'm actually not. You're just not in the Christian spaces that I am. And one of those spaces that we were engulfed in was Rachel's. And I'm just like, it is a highlight of my life for sure that I got to spend that time with her. And I've said it before on the podcast, but she was this massive celebrity in that culture. And we had to text because there were some technical difficulties, and which is why you weren't able to join. And she still texted me after that. I mean, it was just wild that this woman, who had to have been so busy, had 2 tiny kids, had this, online congregation basically to take care of, would still take time to do that. And I think, to me, that says, that's not a humble brag. It's really just like the only way I can share with you that, like, whatever she looked like outwardly was clearly who she was inwardly too.
Yeah, lucky us.
Yeah.
Also, we hustled real hard for, guests of that caliber. And I just think of you, like, recording under a library table during a baseball tournament. Yeah. Like, it wasn't always like, let's get Rachel Held Evans on the line,
That's so true.
To establish all of that. And that, like you said, it's been such a joy in my life as well.
Yeah, so let's talk about why we're ending. You got some news, sister.
I do. So I wasn't really, like, looking for a big change in my life, but we had some kind of job insecurity post-pandemic.
Which could literally be a whole podcast itself of your fam.
So my husband works in the public school system. Our school system is the first in Iowa to be taken over by the state. So our superintendent was removed, and we have a very heavy state presence in what's going on in our school district. So there's just been a lot of uncertainty for a lot of people about a lot of people within the system about their jobs, really. And we were definitely one of those. So for a couple months, we weren't sure if my husband Jake would have a job, what it would be. And during that time, I just realized, I've been freelancing for 15 years. It's been a wonderful thing to be able to provide some for my family, but not provide health insurance, which health insurance being tied to our job is a podcast for another decade. But so there was just a lot of insecurity. And in that time, I brushed up my resume thinking, like, well, maybe it's time for me to join the more traditional workforce and find a job that offers health insurance and a little bit more stability for our family. Basically, I was tiptoeing into this, and then I saw a posting at a local museum. They were hiring a marketing person, and it just felt like that couldn't be a better position for me, who was looking for something new. So I accepted the job at the Putnam Museum and Science Center. I'll be the VP of Marketing, and I start next week. It's been a sad, it's been a really exciting thing that's happening. It's also been really sad because, like I said, I wasn't looking for a job. I love my jobs. I own a co-working space in the downtown of my town. I have been a contractor with an incredible NGO that works in Tanzania called Empower Tanzania, and obviously this podcast. So there's been a lot of really sad goodbyes, but also a lot of excitement for what I'm jumping into.
A lot of excitement. And we talked so much, you and I personally, about how disgusting it is that healthcare is tied to jobs here in the United States, in the wealthiest country in the world. And so, but that is the reality. And so when things were so intense with Jake and for your family, it just made sense. And it's so exciting. We've talked about how we were mostly stay-at-home moms with some freelance jobs, or in my case, like personal training and things like that, for the bulk of our lives. And we still really wanted to prioritize that combination, like some fun money, but mostly just like investing in the kids, because we had the great privilege and luxury of doing that. But in my case, now, as of today, I have 4 in high school and 1 in college. And so they just require less time. And even though you have Cinta's a little bit younger, they're still requiring far less time. They're still all in school. During school years, you have a driver, so that also opens up some flexibility. And post-pandemic, we are living in a world where one of my jobs is to consult with an international nonprofit that's based out of New York, but I get to do it here in Michigan, right? So it's a whole new world where you'll also be able to do some hours from home and still be able to kind of have that mix, even though it's a full-time position for you. And for me too, I was working 4 different jobs. I've since lately consolidated, now not counting the podcast, into 2.
Which is huge.
Yeah, which is huge for me. But it also, combined with those 2 jobs, is a full-time job in hours, 35 to 40 hours. And so, yeah, we just, it came to, there was like that's the practical reason we're ending for now, right? Because we have full-time jobs now and we didn't before. And like you just mentioned, we work our ass off on this podcast. It might not feel that way to you, but so much behind the scenes is going on all the time. And it has just been really stressful. Obviously, I started before you, but it's been really stressful to figure out how to manage that time with this podcast, especially because we lost sponsors over the pandemic, which is fine and understandable, but that also means we weren't getting paid for it. And so it was just hard to carve out that time knowing I'm actually getting paid for these and my job would be on the line if I don't do those, and it's not for this podcast. And so even though we continue to find great joy in this, it just became harder anyway. So practically that would be why we're closing it out.
Good stuff coming. Listeners, you don't have to worry about us. Good stuff coming.
That's right. But we had talked about this even before the jobs, Leslie, because the landscape of podcasting has changed so much.
Oh my gosh, it's changed so much over the last 5+ years. I mean, we were talking in the beginning how we shot to New and Noteworthy right away and stayed there for almost 2 years. I mean, it was unbelievable, because there's no way that would have happened now. These, in this current podscape landscape. Podscape? Did I just
Podscape? I like it. I don't know that that's an actual word, but we're
that's
using
our swan song to the podcasting industry as our gift as we leave. Podscape.
That's right. And we started to notice the podscape change, and it's one of the reasons we rebranded ourselves. I mean, one was just that we felt like Mama Bear Dares didn't necessarily fit with what we were doing now or always really. But the other one was just like, okay, we've got to mix it up. We've got to try to be a little more noticeable is the wrong word, but continue to build the community. And so we tried to make it more obvious what we were doing, et cetera, et cetera. And it really just didn't work, right? Like, we kept the same listeners, but it's a completely different industry, like we talked about. Over the pandemic, I'm sure you all noticed, celebrities got real bored and they all started a podcast, and which is good for them. Like, we have no shame, no shade to those people who started it, because we obviously love the industry ourselves. But it did change it for those of us. I consider us like mom and pop shops compared to the Walmarts. They already came with millions of followers and millions of listeners. And, I think of Glennon Doyle, who just started her podcast too. And it shot immediately to the top one. And then Apple promotes those. And then she'll be at the top forever, which great. Glennon Doyle's great. We've talked about her a lot on this podcast. But that changes it for the Tessie and Leslies of the world. That makes it a lot harder to find an audience, have your audience find you, and to just make an impact in the podscape.
Yeah, I love how you equate us to a mom and pop store. And so, our podcast will still be up on iTunes and all of the places. And so I do hope people will still, if, you've missed episodes, like go back and listen. But I think it's just another important reminder to support your mom and pop stores, whether they're like an actual physical storefront or an author that that doesn't have a huge platform. Buy their books, buy their albums, and listen to the podcasts, that are just a little bit smaller and still have a lot of substance and good worth, because I definitely think we've all seen that. Now if you look at New and Noteworthy, it's virtually all hosted by podcasts that are hosted by celebrities, or who've been elevated by another, podcasting kind of company platform. Yes. So it's a changing landscape. We noticed it during pandemic. Advertisers freaked out immediately. We lost sponsors. People weren't commuting as much. We lost listeners, and so we really, I think, came back as the perfectors and gave it everything for several months, along with our producer Kathy, who is amazing. And another great joy of this podcast for me has just been getting to know her. I think I've made a lifelong friend in Kathy. So that too influenced the end of this podcast, but it certainly doesn't take away, I don't think, what we have done. And we don't want to sound like we're like bemoaning this new world, right? Like I don't want to be like the ladies that are just like, it's changed and it's terrible.
Yeah, but like one takeaway I've gotten from this is what we noticed too, that it requires for you to be an author. As we have mentioned before, you and I wrote a book proposal. Big publishers loved it, but basically said you need to have more Instagram followers. It's the same with podcasting now, and it's going to be the same with any new medium. You have to be content creators, and that's what we do for our job,
right?
Our paid jobs. And the truth of the matter is, neither of us love that. We don't want to like post just because we're supposed to post and grow followers. We don't like that. And so it's not that we're just a couple olds bemoaning the new world. It really is just like, it's a good reminder for me to encourage y'all that you can opt out of that. And we did. We tried really hard on Instagram for a while, and it wasn't that it wasn't fun. It just was like we all three of us, including Kathy, got to the point where it's like, I don't know what to post, y'all. Knowing you have to post every day, and you have to do reels, and you have to do stories, and you have to do this. And we just felt like that's not, we were like pure in this podcasting for pure reasons. And it felt to us, no shame to anyone that it doesn't feel this way too. And it feels genuine and authentic and great, but it just felt a little icky to us. And so we are also like, we can opt out of that.
Yeah. And I think it's something to have on our radar as well, of what kind of literature and what kind of books and content is being created and put out into this world by kind of the gatekeepers of publishing, podcasting, all of those, just the language arts, creative arts, and just be aware of that, of just like how does the next brilliant novel get past the marketing team at a publishing house that's like, yeah, this is amazing and I love the content of this, but they just don't have the platform. Like there's something like a little soul crushing in that.
Yeah. And we want y'all to be able to consume your own things with that nod too. The celebrities who I'm seeing people share their podcasts like, this was so good, I'll listen and I'll say, we had a guest on 2 years ago that said that better.
Yes.
right? Like, filter your thinking. Are they really saying something new and profound, or is it just because they have a platform and you think, oh, millions of people love this person and obviously there's something new and profound? And really, we had a guest say that 2 years ago that doesn't have that platform. So it's more that, like, I want to encourage everyone to listen with that filter on, to say, not to say don't give those people your listens to, but prioritize who you're reading, who you're listening to, who you're buying from, with the people who are making that same great content and gifts and things like that, but that aren't getting those same things. And I know it's cooler to share on your stories and things like that you're listening to the newest X podcast of this celebrity, but also be the cool one that finds little tiny mom and pop stores and online boutiques and podcasters who are doing really cool things and share those. I mean, that's what I started to notice and get really disheartened by, was just like, it became cool to start sharing like the big podcasts. And I'm like, we got nowhere to go from here, you know? And I also don't have the energy, and we didn't have the money, the marketing budget to try that. And so it just does feel a little bit easier to, like, okay, like, just like your mom and pop shops, when you don't, I've certainly been there where I'm like, oh my God, I didn't frequent them as much as I do Target or whatever. And then they close, and I still miss going to Lee's Adventure Sports all the time. Zach and I bemoan that. So it's just a good reminder to do that and to think about that all the time.
Yeah. Well said. Very true. Tessie, we don't know if this is a forever ending. We're going to keep our host platform. We're going to keep paying them to keep our episodes archived, and so we'll exist in that space on the internet. You'll be able to download old episodes, more recent episodes also, that'll live there for a while. But we're both kind of just gonna jump into our new adventures and see what happens.
Yeah, like we've talked about, maybe we'll do a series down the line and just make an excuse to the three of us meeting in Chicago and just recording 10 episodes in one weekend and eating all of the really good food Chicago offers. Maybe that's going to be the thing. We don't know for sure. Or maybe this is the ending, but we're leaving a window cracked because we do love the space and we love you guys so much. And we're just so grateful for everything this pod's going to do. And there's a part of me that's like a little scared to not talk to you, to not have my crutch, my sister, like on our appointment. Every Friday we get to talk to each other, and there's a little just deep sadness that that's not going to be on, because of course we talk personally for 20 minutes plus before we hit record.
True.
And so
don't remind me of that. I haven't thought through all of this totally.
But that's why, like, we both might be like, nope, we need something on the schedule once a month, we're popping
just
in.
Kidding,
guys. We just don't know.
We're back. Yes.
Exactly.
Okay, well, I think that's a wrap. If you all have anything to tell us, we'd still love to hear from you. We'll keep a presence on Instagram. You can also email the podcast at producer@theperfectors.com. Our website will remain up through the end of the year, theperfectors.com. We hope you'll go back and listen to past episodes that you might have missed. Not because we are beholden to sponsors for those numbers, but because we think that we've put some good content into the world, and we're really proud of the work that we have done. So this podcast was produced by Kathy Engstrom, Tessie Klipsch, and me, Leslie Klipsch. And we're so grateful that you're sticking around and that you've stuck around with us for so long. And it truly is our most sincere hope that you will continue to go out into this world and take the courage with you, the love with you, the love in your heart to perfect the world around you.